Hello, I'm John Broyles, and this is my wife, Jean Elizabeth Treat Broyles. My mother was Leila Verl Dunagan, and her father was Sylvester S. Dunagan, and her mother was Annie Watkins. Before my mother died, she left me these things that you see on the coffee table in front of us. These are things that she and Sylvester thought would be good to keep for their descendants. So one day when I was looking at these things here in our house, I thought, I just should do something with those, because when I die, my children won't know anything about these people, who they are, whatever. Plus, there's other descendants of Sylvester that would be interested in these also, besides my children. So I decided to do something, and I digitized all of these pictures and letters, put them into my computer, and I organized them in chronological order, the best I could. And I've presented them to you. But the thing I thought about then was that I think most people nowadays like to look at videos rather than to read a book. So I thought, well, I'll present these in the form of a video. So that's how this video came to be. I have put in this video some information about historical events that happened during Sylvester's life. Hopefully that will add some context to the video and to Sylvester's life and make it a little bit more interesting for you. But the basis for this video is just the things that you see here. So if you see something on the screen and you think to yourself, now why did John show that to me? Well, it's because it was here. So this is the basis. It's not a drama. It's just showing you what is here. So I hope you enjoy it. Happy viewing.
When Johnny comes marching home again, hurrah, hurrah, we'll give him a hearty welcome then, hurrah, hurrah. Oh, the men will cheer, the boys will shout, the ladies they will all turn out, and we'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home. And we'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home. Get ready for the Jubilee, hurrah, hurrah. We'll give the hero 3 times 3, hurrah, hurrah. Oh, the laurel wreath is ready now to place upon his loyal brow, and we'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home. And we'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home. In 1861, hurrah, hurrah, that was when the war begun, hurrah, hurrah. In 1862, both sides were falling to, and we'll all drink stone wine when Johnny comes marching home. And we'll all drink stone wine when Johnny comes marching home. In 1863, hurrah, hurrah, old lady ended slavery, hurrah, hurrah. In 1863, old lady ended slavery, and we'll all drink stone wine when Johnny comes marching home. And we'll all drink stone wine when Johnny comes marching home. In 1864, hurrah, hurrah, it called for 500,000 more, hurrah, hurrah. In 1865, they talked rebellious strife, and we'll all drink stone wine when Johnny comes marching home. And we'll all drink stone wine when Johnny comes marching home.
This is the story of Sylvester Sydney Dunagan. Sylvester was born on June 17, 1861, in Morgan County, Indiana. When he was born, his family consisted of his father, Thomas, his mother, Eliza Applegate, and 7 brothers and sisters. Thomas and Eliza's oldest child, was Sarah Mariah. She was 14 years old. The next child was Candace. She was 10 years old, and following her were Mary, 8 years old, Millie Emma, 6 years old, William, 5 years old, John F., 3 years old, and Nathaniel, 1 year old. With all of those sisters, Sylvester's mother must have had a lot of help in taking care of her new baby boy. There was another family in Indiana that was important in Sylvester's family story. That was the George Ford family that lived in Hendricks County, Indiana. This county borders on Morgan County on the north. At the time of Sylvester's birth, the George Ford family consisted of George, aged 44, his wife, Armenta, aged 45, Fitchus, a son, 21 years old, Chichester, 18 years old, Noble, 16 years old, Eliza J., 14 years old, Mary E., 11 years old, Ellen Armenta, 9 years old, Sarah Ann, 6 years old, and Rachel, 2 years old. In the future, these two families would get connected by marriage not once, but twice. Sylvester's father was born in Kentucky. His ancestors 3 generations back came to the United States from Ireland. Sylvester's mother, Eliza Applegate, was born in Indiana. Sylvester's father was a farmer. George Ford was born in Ohio. George was also a farmer. His family lived a little farther south in Bartholomew County, Indiana, in 1850, but in 1860 they lived in Hendricks County, just next to Morgan County, where Sylvester was born. Perhaps they got acquainted while they were living in that area. So what was life like for farmers in Indiana in 1861? I will add some pictures and short videos to help you visualize what is being said. Well, they had to bring their water from someplace outside of the house into the house. Water was very important for farming as well as for living. A farm needed a source of water. It could be from a river, a lagoon or lake, or from a well in the ground. When people wanted to clean up, they had to use water from a pan. Maybe they would use a washcloth to wash their faces or other parts of their body. Of course, the water in the pan would get dirty, so they would have to throw it out when they were finished. Maybe they would throw it on their vegetable garden. Bringing water from outside into the house was a difficult and tiring job. Often the older children would have to do this each day. Taking a bath was usually done once a week, on Saturday, so that everyone could be clean to go to church on Sunday. However, if the people wanted hot water, they must heat the water. Usually, people had wood-burning stoves to heat food and water. Sometimes a bathtub would be filled with water, and everyone would bathe in that water. The last person to bathe would be bathing in kind of dirty water. But that was the way they lived. For heating, they used wood for fuel. Sometimes they would use buffalo or cow chips. These were the buffalo or cow poop that had dried in the sun, and someone in the family would have to go outside and collect it in a pail and bring it back into the house. In the winter, everyone had to wear warm pajamas because the wood stove in the house would not heat the house evenly, and in the bedrooms it might be quite cold at night. When the sun went down, it got dark, the same as it does where we live now. However, in 1861, people did not have electric lights. So after the sun went down, they would have to light a candle or an oil-burning lamp to provide light, like this one. This was Sylvester's oil lamp. These only provided light in a relatively small area, however, so they might have a candle or a lamp for each person. I have heard that Abraham Lincoln read his school books and the Bible from the light in the fireplace at his house in Illinois. If people wanted to go to a faraway place, they had to walk or ride a horse. There were also horse-drawn buggies, which people could use. Horses were also used to do farm work. They were hitched to a plow or other equipment, and the horse would pull that equipment. Today we measure the power of a car engine by how much horsepower it has. This measure for power started with the use of a horse to provide power for farming. Of course, since a horse was so important to life on a farm, it was important to take good care of a family's horse, and usually each child had his or her own responsibilities to feed the horses or the chickens, or to pick up the eggs that the chickens had laid. If the family had a milk cow, someone would have to milk the cow and save the warm milk in a safe place. The thick yellow cream on top of the milk would be skimmed off and used to make butter or cream. And what did they do when they had to go potty? Well, they dug a deep hole in the ground. On top of that hole, they would build a little structure or house with a door and a raised ledge like a seat. In this raised part, they would cut a hole just over the hole in the ground. So if a person wanted to go potty, he or she would have to go outside to this little structure and sit on the seat and, well, use the toilet. This was not so convenient at night or in the winter time. People would have to make sure that they could sleep through the night without using the potty. If a person had to use the potty at night, they might take a candle with them for light. Oftentimes a family would have a bedpan, or a pan into which they could go potty right in the house. Then in the morning they would take it outside and dump it into the hole in the ground. The use of candles, however, with a burning flame was dangerous. If the candle was to fall on the ground or inside of the wooden structure, it might catch the place on fire and burn it down. Well, what did they do if a fire got started? They did not have a fire department to call. They just had to get water from the river or well and try to put out the fire themselves. Sometimes this was too hard to do, and their buildings would just burn down if they caught on fire. This was what life was like for farmers in 1861. Another important thing that was happening in the country was a disagreement about whether people should be able to have slaves to do their work or not. In the northern states, the people thought no, but in the southern states, people thought yes. In the South, people raised a lot of cotton, so they needed a lot of people to pick the cotton and to do other farm work. So they bought slaves from slave traders over the years. These slaves were mostly people from Africa, and they had dark skin. They were called Negroes or blacks. In 1861, this issue came to a point of decision for the U.S. government, and the government decided that slavery would not be permitted. For the South, this was an economic issue as well as a convenience for them. Well, a big war got started. When Abraham Lincoln was elected as the President of the United States in January of 1861, a short time later the states of South Carolina, Florida, Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, and Texas withdrew from the Union that was called the United States of America. A little later, these states were joined by Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. These states called themselves the Confederate States and prepared for a war. The first battle was on April 12th at Fort Sumter, Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. This was called the Civil War. A patriotic song that was popular during the Civil War was the Battle Hymn of the Republic by Julia Ward Howe. Here is a portion of that song. This was a sad thing that happened because it divided the people in the United States, and there were a lot of people who were killed. It was done for a good cause, however. I heard that more people were killed in the United States Civil War than in any foreign wars that we have fought since then. Well, I think Sylvester did not know anything about this because he was just a little baby. But I'm sure that his parents and his older siblings knew about it and were worried. You can imagine what Sylvester did as the years passed. I am sure that each year he grew bigger and learned more things. In 1866, Sarah Mariah, Sylvester's oldest sister, met a young man named Granville C. Costin. They got to know each other, and they liked each other. They decided that they would like to spend the rest of their lives together, so they got married. They were married on the 9th of October, 1866. She was 21 years old. Sarah moved out of her parents' home and into another home with her husband. In 1866, something else happened in a far-away state, Illinois. A baby girl was born. Her name was Annie Watkins. Her parents were Richard and Catherine Russell Watkins. Annie was born in Manhattan, Will County, Illinois, on May 27, 1866. She would be an important person in the life of Sylvester. Sylvester was 5 years old when Annie was born. By this time, the Civil War was over, and the country was suffering from all of the deaths and conflict that had occurred in the country. However, Sylvester did not have to participate in this war. Another baby was born in 1866. This time it was Minnie M. Myrick. She was born in Monrovia, Morgan County, Indiana. She would become an important in Sylvester's brother's life. In 1866, Noble Ford was 21 years old, and Ellen Arminta Ford was 14 years old, and Condessa Dunagan was 15 years old. Condessa was born 1 year before Ellen Arminta. The next year after this, 1867, Ella Arminta Ford found a nice young man named Samuel Bourne. They liked each other a lot. They even thought that they might like to spend the rest of their lives together. So you can imagine what happened. Yes, they decided to get married. They were married on August 27th, 1867. Ellen was 15 years old. Then Noble Ford and Candessa Dunagan started to like each other too. In fact, they really liked each other. So you can imagine what happened. Yes, they got married too. Maybe they thought that if Samuel and Ellen Arminta could get married, they could also. Noble Ford and Candessa Dunagan were married on September 22nd, 1867, in Owen County, Indiana. This was a little bit south and west from where Sylvester and his family lived in Morgan County. Candessa was 16 years old. Well, 3 couples, Sarah Maria and husband, Candace and husband, and Ellen Arminta and husband, started out their lives living as 3 new families. The next year, 1868, another good thing happened. Sylvester's mom had a new baby boy. They named him Samuel F. Dunagan. I am sure everyone in their family was very happy about this. Also in 1868, Candace Ford had a baby boy. They named him Charles. I am sure his parents were very happy about this also. Sylvester was 7 years old at this time. In 1869, Ellen Arminta Ford had a baby girl. Her name was Viola Rosalie Bourne. She was born on January 17, 1869. At some time later, Noble, Candace, and Charles Ford moved to Independence Township, Macon County, Missouri. When the census was taken on June 22, 1870, they were living there, plus Noble Ford's father, George. Now, why he was living with them there, and not in Indiana with the rest of his family, I don't know. Maybe he was visiting, or maybe he was having difficulty getting along with his wife and children. We don't know. In 1870, Sylvester and his family were living in Owens County, Indiana. So, sometime before that, his family must have moved from Morgan County to Owens County, the place where Candessa and Noble Ford had married in 1867. Also, in 1870, another little girl was born. Her name was Lily Jane Watkins. She was born to Richard and Catherine Watkins in Will County, Illinois. They were also the parents of Annie Watkins, that was born in 1866. Annie was 4 years old when Lily was born. In this year, Sylvester was 9 years old. Here is a picture that might be of Sylvester. There was no name on the picture, but it was with the other pictures of Sylvester and his family. Just the next year, 1871, another little girl was born. Her name was Lillian Bourne, and her parents were Samuel and Ellen Arminta Bourne. She was born on May 20th, 1871, in Alaska, Owen County, Indiana. Lillian lived for a long time. Not everything that happens in a family is good. In 1871 also, George and Arminta Ford, Ellen Arminta's parents, got divorced. This is not good. It says in the Bible that God hates divorce. We do not know why they got divorced, just that they did. Well, in 1873, George got married to Emily Frances Cook Bunch. Evidently, this was a second marriage for her also. In this year, Sylvester was 12 years old. In 1874, a happy thing happened. In this year, a new baby boy was born to Ellen Arminta Ford. His name was Oscar Perry Bourne. He was born in Alaska, Owen County, Indiana. Sylvester was 13 years old when Oscar was born. A little more time passed, and in 1876, a shocking thing happened. Oscar and Lillian's daddy, Samuel Jefferson Bourne, died. This was terrible. He died on May 15, 1876, in Gosport, Indiana. Samuel was 27 years old, too young to die for most people. There was no explanation of why he died. During this time, tuberculosis was a dreaded disease. Ellen was 24 years old. Now Ellen had 3 children, Viola Rosalie, Lily, and Oscar, with no husband. What would she do? Taking care of children took time. Maybe she was not strong enough to do all of the farm work. We do not know what she did, but most people asked their family to help them when they had difficulties. Maybe that is what Ellen did. However, her father and mother had gotten a divorce, so they were also suffering from this separation. Maybe Samuel's family helped her. Somehow she managed to live on. So what kind of music did people have in 1876? From the history books, we learn that most of the music was religious music and involved worship or soul searching. There were no radios then, nor were there any record players or electronic music boxes which could produce music. People had to sing or play their own music. Sometimes they could hear a professional group perform at a big city, but they probably did not travel very much. Many people came to the United States with musical instruments like guitars and even pianos. There were companies that printed sheet music that people could buy and then sing and play in their own home or group. Since there was no easy source for music, some people formed small groups and traveled around singing and taking money from people for this. These were called minstrels. Many were black people from the South who did not have other work. Others were Christian people who wanted to share their religion with others. One popular song was, "Oh, Dem Golden Slippers." During this time, popular music came primarily from 2 sources. One was from an African heritage through the African slaves and became known as ragtime music. The other kind of music was religious. An example of this is the song, "What a Friend We Have in Jesus." Well, in 1879, Arminta Ford, Noble and Ellen's mother, married James B. Callahan. They were married May 19th. Sylvester was 18 years old at this time. In 1880, Noble and Candace Ford had moved back to Indiana and were living in Ashland, Morgan County, Indiana. At 18 years old, Sylvester was a young man. Most young men of this age could work on the farm and take responsibility. Perhaps Sylvester started to travel a little to see what the rest of the world was like. Maybe he wanted to have a farm of his own so that he could raise crops, sell them, and support a family of his own. Being a landowner carried with it a level of prestige. For a long time, people could not vote in elections in the United States unless they owned land. I guess people thought that unless a person owned land, they did not have a personal interest in the country. But for whatever the reason, Sylvester traveled. In the next year, 1880, he had been in Buffalo County, Nebraska, long enough to be required to pay personal property taxes. On January 26, 1880, he paid a tax in Buffalo County, Nebraska of $7.26 on property worth $90. Not only Sylvester was thinking of Nebraska, but Richard and Catherine Watkins in Illinois were also. Perhaps a young man has to have a dream. So what was going on in 1879 that made Sylvester go to Nebraska? Here is what the family of Richard and Catherine Watkins wrote about Nebraska in the Watkins Family History Book. This, quote, the history of this semi-arid land of southwestern Nebraska that the Watkins and Hopkins and Francis families pioneered goes something like this. Between 1841 and 1866, some 350,000 people passed through this unsettled prairie via covered wagon on the Oregon and various other trails in the Platte River Valley, some 30 miles north of Venango, going west to Oregon, the gold fields of California, and other destinations in the west. In the 1850s, freighters such as Russell, Majors, and Waddell, with their rigs of 10 huge covered wagons pulled by teams of 6 to 12 oxen each, plied the Platte River Valley with supplies going west. The area now called Perkins County was then part of the winter feeding grounds of one of the largest known herds of American bison, or buffalo, estimated to number 2 million. In the early 1870s, the Union Pacific train was stopped several times by this herd, which measured by the train crew as stretching from Cottonwood Springs, near North Platte, to Sterling, Colorado, 160 miles long and over a mile wide. Maps of 1850 to 1875 label this high, dry prairie between the Republican River drainage on the south, Binkelman and McCook, and the Platte River Valley on the north as the Wide Buffalo Divide. This includes the area where our pioneer ancestors would settle. In 1861, the Transcontinental Telegraph replaced the Pony Express, and in 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad system was completed, built some 30 miles north of the Venango area and paralleling the Platte River on the north side, on which Ogallala, Nebraska was founded. In 1867, Nebraska became a state, but, according to Jack McCormick of Golden, Colorado, the vast silent prairie was far from being civilized. The western two-thirds of the new state was still mainly the home of the lobo wolf, the rattlesnake, the buffalo, and the Indian. The Arapaho and Cheyenne had been pushed into Colorado, leaving the Pawnee Nation and the dreaded Sioux to quarrel over the hunting grounds of southwest Nebraska. By 1868, there were over 100 buffalo hunters roaming this area. At first, these men killed the buffalo for their valuable fur and hide, which was in demand by the harness and saddle industry. In the mid to late 1860s, the railroad began hiring hunters to provide meat for their crews and to clear the tracks of the huge mammals. Also in the 1860s, the Army encouraged the hunting of buffalo, believing that if the buffalo were gone, the Indians would be too. Naturally, the 1860s was an era of conflict in this area, as Indians fought back against the slaughter of their mainstay for food and shelter, and against the impending virtual elimination of their culture. The names of some of the buffalo hunters of this area became part of Western legend. According to Jack McCormick, Doc Carver had his favorite hunting camp about 6 miles west of the present town of Imperial on Sand Creek. He later joined with Buffalo Bill to form the world-famous Wild West Show in 1883. In the winter of 1872-73, Carver killed over 5,600 buffalo for their hides. Later, he brought down 160 buffalo in one day to win the Buffalo Hunting Championship contest from Jack McCall on the prairies north of Stinking Water Creek, now Chase and Hayes counties. Wild Bill Hickok, who was later killed by McCall, also hunted around the Republican River Valley for a few years. And of course, there was Buffalo Bill Cody. Many of our ancestors did indeed see Buffalo Bill Cody. When they arrived in this area in 1886 to 1888, he was one of the local horse traders from which at least the James Hopkins family obtained a horse. Bill Cody established a ranch in North Platte, Nebraska, some 80 miles northwest of the Venango Homestead area. In 1883, he began his Wild West show, which toured Europe at first. After the turn of the century especially, he traveled via the local trains to advertise his show in all the little towns, including Venango, along the route. His Wild West show did put on performances in Sterling and Julesburg, Colorado. Julesburg is within 30 miles of Venango, and probably many of our ancestors made the trip in 1912 to see the show. Local newspaper accounts of the time tell of families coming from as far as McCook in horse-drawn buggies and camping out on the way to see the show. We know that Will Watkins attended a sheriff's meeting at Buffalo Bill's ranch in North Platte, and the Elmer Watkins family attended the Wild West show performance in Sterling. Buffalo Bill died in 1917. The town of Ogallala on the Union Pacific Railroad had begun in 1869 as a trading place for these hunters of the southwest Nebraska plains. As the buffalo herds were killed off, the Indians were forced onto reservations by 1876. This was followed from about 1875 to 1884 by the Longhorn cattle trails from Texas up to the trailhead at Ogallala. The cattle were driven north on trails that crossed the eastern end of present-day Perkins County to Ogallala. There they were sold to cattlemen who grazed them on the free and open public grasslands of Keith County. In 1874, cattle pens and a loading chute were added to the rail yard in Ogallala, and in 1876, 100,000 head of longhorn cattle were shipped out of Ogallala. Ogallala was a very small settlement of permanent residents. In the first issue of a newspaper in Ogallala in 1884, the population of all of Keith County was given as 63 people. The cattle herds swelled the town's population in the summer and fall with rowdy southern drovers. In 1881, there were 6 saloons in Ogallala, open day and night. In 1884, Texas fever, a cattle disease carried by ticks in the southern herds, caused Kansas and Nebraska to enact quarantine laws, and the cattle drives came to an abrupt halt. Ogallala soon became a more law-abiding town. After 1884, then, came the era of the settler in this southwest corner of Nebraska. The sodbuster replaced the cowboys of the longhorn herds. The Homestead Act of 1862 had authorized the granting of 160 acres of land to any citizen who would occupy and improve that quarter of land for 5 years. The railroad advertised the virtues of this free High Plains area, and the settlers began to come. Many came by the Union Pacific Railroad to Ogallala, shipping their belongings and livestock in a railroad car, too. Thus they were called emigrant trains. They came the last 20 to 40 miles from Ogallala to their homesteads in covered wagons. The hardships of the time can be noted in that during the winter and spring of 1886, 1,000 settlers came to settle in the town or immediate area of Ogallala, and the newspaper at that time estimated that less than 100 of those stayed." End quote. Sylvester must have traveled some during the next few years. He went back to Owen County, Indiana, where his family lived after being in Buffalo County, Nebraska for a while. On June 16th, when the 1880 census was taken, he was living with his family, Father Thomas, age 56, Mother Eliza, 53, Brother William L., 23, Sister Emma, 24, Brother John F., 22, Brother Seward G., 14, and Brother Samuel, 12, in Harrison Township, Owen County, Indiana. Sylvester was 18 years old. In an obituary that was written later, it said that Sylvester came to Nebraska in 1883. He evidently lived in Gibbon, Buffalo County, Nebraska, where he had paid taxes in 1880. Perhaps others of his friends and family also went to Nebraska, and maybe even Buffalo County. Perhaps the West was an appealing place for them. In about 1883, a picture was taken of the Richard and Catherine Watkins family. This was probably taken in Illinois before they went to Nebraska. Lillian and Annie Watkins are in this picture. Lily is the second from the left standing, and Annie is the rightmost sitting. Some of the people in Sylvester's life went to Buffalo County, Nebraska, where Noble Ford, his wife Candessa Dunagan Ford, and Ellen Arminta Ford born. Sylvester and Ellen must have spent some time together and got to know each other pretty well. Evidently they liked each other. So on February 18th, 1885, they got married in Dodge County, Nebraska. Dodge County is near the eastern side of Nebraska, whereas Buffalo County is in the center of the state and a little south. Perhaps they traveled around in this area during the 5 years between 1880 and 1885. The 1885 census, taken on June 3rd, states that Sylvester, 23, was living with his wife Ellen, 32, Rosie Bowen, 16, Lily Bowen, 14, and Oscar Bowen, 11, in Sharon Township, Buffalo County, Nebraska. The last name Bowen was sometimes substituted for Bourne. One of their neighbors was Noble and Candessa Ford. Noble and Candessa had the following people in their home in Sharon Township, Buffalo County, Nebraska, at the time of the census: Charles, 16, Leona, 14, George, 8, Leslie, 6, Pearl, 4, and Albert, 3 months. In 1885, a popular song was American Patrol. Here is a picture of Sylvester and Ellen at the time of their wedding. They look so healthy and strong. Now I want to ask you to look at their faces carefully. Study them and tell me what you think they are thinking when this picture was taken. First, look at Ellen. Now look at Sylvester. What do you think Ellen is thinking? Well, I will tell you what I think she is thinking. I cannot be sure of this, but this is my guess. Quote, "This is a great deal for me. Now I will not be a widow anymore. I will have someone to provide for me and to help me take care of my children. I will not be alone anymore." End quote. Did you say something like that? Now for Sylvester, I think he is thinking, quote, "Whoa, am I scared? Am I making a mistake here, marrying an older woman with children who are not too much younger than me? Is there anywhere I can run if I want to get out of here?" End quote. Well, Sylvester wrote a letter to his daughter Leila Verl in 1940, in which he said, quote, "When Ellen and I went to Kearney to get our license, I almost lost my head, so afraid I'd made a mistake. But oh, how glad I was when it was all over and she was my wife. I loved her and thought how foolish I had been." End quote. So you see, I had some information about this. Well, it seems Sylvester was scared at first, but after they got married, he really liked being married to Ellen. Whoopee! A sad thing that happened in this year of 1885 was that Ellen's mother, Arminta, was divorced from her second husband, James B. Callahan. No details are available, just a statement in the census. In 1886, Sylvester paid personal property taxes in Buffalo County, Nebraska. And then there was a big move later in this year. Sylvester and Ellen and Noble and Kendesif both decided to move further west in Nebraska and register for land under the Homestead Act. This was a big decision. It appears that Sylvester's younger brother, Seward, also did the same. Here is a story about this move and their life afterwards, written by Lillian, Ellen's daughter by Samuel Bourne. Lillian Bourne Smith came to Chase County the spring of 1886 when she was 15 years old, with her stepfather, Sylvester Dunagan, mother, a sister, and brother, coming in a covered wagon from Gibbon, Nebraska to Ogallala, making the trip in a week. They were accompanied by the Noble Ford family, consisting of mother, father, 5 boys, and 1 girl. Noble Ford and her mother were brother and sister, as was Mrs. Ford and Sylvester Dunagan. The Dunagan family had 2 cows, 2 horses, chickens, and 2 pigs in a box, which were fed the leftover milk, and they nearly became too large for the box. They shipped the rest of their belongings on the train to Ogallala. Their possessions, added to those of other people's, stretched for a mile along the track. Nothing was stolen, although many people didn't get their goods for a week. Because of rain, they slept in the car and began their journey south the next morning, traveling 10 miles before making camp for another night. The next day, the children drove the cattle. Lillian wore out her shoes and was obliged to go barefoot all summer. The wagons and stock arrived at the homestead on Section 9840 on Easter morning, April 25, 1886. They took the cover off the wagon and put it on the ground and lived in it until a dugout was made. It was dug about 3 feet in the ground, sod laid up until a sufficient height was reached, with a board roof covered with paper held down by sod. The walls were not plastered and the floor was dirt. In this home, on July 1st, 1886, a little girl was born, Sylvia, very likely the first child born in the new country. One of the pigs was given to the doctor for his part. They used water from the lagoons that had grass bottoms when the water was fresh. Their alternative was to haul it 3 miles from Woodchester, where there was a dug well. They used a half-barrel on a rope for a bucket, using a horse to pull it out. At times, the settlers lined up at the well and were forced to take their turn. Winchester was on Northeast Quarter, Section 2841, comprised of a sod store and post office run by James Hopkins, which was replaced by a nice frame house in a few years. It was a year of hardships, and when Sylvia was 5 to 6 weeks old, Sylvester walked back to Gibbon and found work and left the family to live from the chickens. But the chickens roosted outside and the coyotes killed most of them. After Sylvester arrived home, he broke a wheel on the wagon. When it was fixed, only $2.40 remained in his pocket. The womenfolk didn't have any new clothes the first year. In October 1886, they moved into a grout house made of rocks cemented together with magnesia, which Sylvester built. It was 14 by 16, 1 room and dirt floor. They put straw or grass on the floor and covered it with rag carpet. Again, Sylvester returned to Buffalo County, taking his stepson, Oscar. He asked his bachelor brother, Seward, on a nearby homestead, to look after the womenfolk while he was away. They had heard of Nebraska blizzards, but had never seen one. They encountered their first one on November 17, 1886. When they awoke in the morning, the wind was howling and snow blowing. They had no outbuildings for the stock, so they brought the cows and pigs up near the east side of the house to give them as much protection as possible. Toward evening, they found one of the cows down. They had heard that people sometimes had to bring their stock into the house during a blizzard, so they brought them in. They stacked the furniture along one wall and turned the carpet back over it and brought in the other 2 cows and pigs and picketed them on the other side of the room by driving pickets into the dirt floor. Seward lived in a dugout and didn't realize how bad the storm had become. He came over about dark and brought the 2 horses which had been down in the old dugout with no roof over their heads. The horses were brought into the house also. The 2 women climbed up on feather beds over the furniture and went to sleep, while Seward sat up all night and kept the livestock in their proper places and the fire going with the Chase County fuel. In the morning it was clear. Seward took the cows and pigs out and picketed them. Noble Ford's had a shed, and he started there with the horses. On the way, the horses threw him off, hurting his back, and he was put to bed at the Ford place. The women went to Seward's place and made breakfast and waited all day for him to come back. When they heard he was hurt, they stayed all night. Some thoughtful neighbors cleaned their house and put fresh straw on the floor, carpet down, and furniture back. In the evening, Sylvester came home exhausted from walking through the snow from Ogallala. He had arrived in Ogallala at 5 o'clock on the train and was anxious to reach his family after hearing of the storm. He was put to bed and had to stay several days. Lillian and her sister found a job at a hotel in Imperial in early spring 1887 and earned the first money of their own. Lillian took a teacher's examination, received a third-grade certificate, and started teaching southeast of Imperial at $15 per month for 3 months. No tax monies were available, and the people subscribed the amount they would pay. She received $2 per week for the first 6 weeks. Then the director let her stay at his home for the rest of the term without pay in order to furnish companionship for his wife while he was away working." End quote. Sylvester worked on the land, but the land did not supply enough for them to live. He had to go to town to get a job to earn money to buy things that they needed. However, he kept farming. On January 23rd, a baby boy was born to another family in Dundee County, south of Sylvester's homestead. His name was Samuel Freeman O'Neill, and his parents were John Belton O'Neill and Elizabeth Danella Miller O'Neill. Another baby was born on March 15, 1888. This baby girl was named Edith Watkins, and her mother was Lily Watkins. However, Lily was not married at the time, so this was not a good situation. There is no information about the details of how she had this baby. However, Lily's parents, Richard and Catherine Watkins, adopted Edith and raised her as their own daughter. About this time, in 1888, a picture was taken of George and Arminta Ford. These are Ellen and Arminta and Noble Ford's parents. They would have been 71 and 72 years old, respectively.
Mighty God.